Before we cut the cake, I have one more gift to give. My father lifted his champagne glass, smiling like he owned the room. I was still sitting beside my new husband, Ethan, in my wedding dress when Dad turned away from me and called my older brother forward. "Brandon, come up here." Brandon stood, already grinning. Dad reached behind his chair and pulled out an oversized ceremonial check. $850,000. The room erupted. "For your wedding," Dad announced, "and whatever's left can go toward the house." My hands went cold. This was my wedding. Then Mom walked toward me holding a tiny white envelope. "And of course," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we didn't forget Chloe." I opened it. A single $50 bill slid into my palm. Someone laughed. Mom smiled. "You wanted a cheap little wedding anyway." Dad looked at Ethan and added, "Poor girl, poor groom. At least they understand their limits." Ethan leaned toward me. "Do you want me to say something?" My first instinct was the same one I'd had my entire life. "Protect them." "No," I whispered, "please." Then Dad lifted Brandon's $850,000 check higher. "At least one of my children knows how to marry with standards." That was when Ethan stood. The laughter died. Dad looked amused. "Relax, Ethan. Maybe someday you'll understand what real money looks like." Ethan stared at him. "Mr. Johnson, do you even know who I am?" Dad's smile tightened. And before Ethan could say another word, a chair scraped loudly near the back of the reception hall. One of Dad's own business advisors had just shot to his feet. For the first time all evening, my father stopped looking pleased with himself. The advisor was staring directly at Ethan. Not casually. Not curiously. He looked stunned. Around us, conversations died one by one. Brandon lowered the enormous check slightly, glancing between Dad and the man standing near the back. Mom stepped closer to my father. "What is this?" she whispered. Dad ignored her. His eyes stayed on Ethan, as if he were trying to solve a problem he should have recognized much earlier. I still held the $50 bill in my hand. That tiny piece of paper suddenly felt less humiliating than it had 30 seconds ago. Because something had shifted. Until that moment, my parents had controlled the room. They had the money. They had the applause. They had Brandon standing beside an $850,000 gift, while I sat there with $50 and the same old expectation that I would smile through being diminished. But now Dad's advisor looked as if the balance of power had quietly changed. Ethan remained beside me, completely calm. Dad gave a short laugh. "I'm sorry. Am I supposed to know you from somewhere?" The advisor took one step forward. My father's expression hardened. "Martin, sit down." Martin didn't. He kept staring at Ethan. And that was the part I couldn't understand. My parents had spent months dismissing Ethan as a modest corporate consultant. They assumed our small wedding meant we couldn't afford anything grander. They had barely bothered asking what he actually did because, in their minds, Brandon was the successful child and I was the daughter who had settled. Yet Martin Hale, a man Dad trusted with some of the most sensitive problems inside his company, clearly knew exactly who my husband was. Dad noticed it too. His fingers tightened around his champagne glass. Ethan looked at me once, silently giving me the chance to stop him. This time, I didn't. And as Martin started walking toward our table, one question suddenly hung over the entire reception. Why had one of my father's own business advisors just recognized the supposedly poor groom my parents had spent the evening mocking? A few hours earlier, I had been standing in front of the bridal room mirror when Mom walked in, looked around, and frowned. "This is it." I turned toward her. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the room, then toward the window overlooking the small garden venue. The flowers, the guest list, the decorations, everything. "I like it." She gave me the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. You always say that when you can't afford better. I stared at her. Ethan and I paid for this ourselves. That's exactly my point. She walked over to the rack where my veil had been hanging. Brandon's wedding is going to be in Santorini. 3 days, private villas, full reception overlooking the water. Good for Brandon. Mom turned sharply. Don't be jealous. I'm not. You sound jealous. I laughed once, mostly because I couldn't believe we were doing this on my wedding day. Mom, I'm getting married in less than an hour. Why are we talking about Brandon? Her expression didn't change. Because you should understand that some people invest according to potential. That sentence landed harder than I wanted it to. For 3 years, I had worked late nights at Dad's development company when projects were struggling. I handled reports, reconciled numbers, stayed after everyone else left, and never once asked for extra pay. When I finally resigned to build my own career, Dad called it betrayal. Brandon had never worked a single week there. Yet somehow, he was still the future. Mom adjusted one of the flowers on the table. And just so you know, she said, your father may give Brandon something substantial tonight. I turned fully toward her. At my reception. Yes. Why? She looked at me like the answer was obvious. Because his future is something worth investing in. For a second, I said nothing. Then I asked, and mine is. Mom picked up her purse. You're too sensitive, Chloe. The door shut behind her. I stayed in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection. A minute later, Ethan stepped inside. He took one look at me. What happened? I told him. All of it. He listened without interrupting. Then he asked quietly, how long are you going to keep protecting people who enjoy embarrassing you? I looked down at my phone. For years, Dad had kept emergency authorization to access my personal savings if the company ever needed short-term help. He had pressured me to use it more than once. My thumb hovered over the banking app. If they disrespect us tonight, I said, I'm done covering for them. Then, minutes before I walked down the aisle, I removed both my parents from the authorization list. Martin, I said, sit down. Dad's voice carried across the reception hall. Martin Hale ignored him. He walked toward our table slowly, his eyes fixed on Ethan. Richard, Martin stopped a few feet away. You seriously don't recognize Ethan Cole? Dad glanced around at the watching guests and forced a laugh. Of course I recognize him. He's my daughter's husband. That's not what I meant. The room went even quieter. Brandon lowered the oversized $850,000 check. Mom stepped beside Dad. What exactly is going on? Dad waved dismissively toward Ethan. Nothing. Ethan is some kind of consultant. Chloe told us that months ago. Ethan finally spoke. I told you I work in investment management. Dad shrugged. Consulting, investments, whatever you want to call it. No, Ethan said calmly. You decided what it meant without ever asking. I looked at my parents. Suddenly, I realized he was right. They had never asked Ethan where he worked. Never asked what his position was. Never asked what kind of investments he managed. They had seen our modest home, our inexpensive wedding plans, and Ethan's refusal to brag about money, and they had filled in everything else themselves. Dad apparently noticed the guests watching him because his confidence returned. He raised Brandon's ceremonial check again. Well, whatever Ethan does, I think the numbers speak for themselves. He tapped the asterisk 850, 000 asterisk printed across the center. This is what success allows you to do for your children. Brandon smiled again. Dad continued, Johnson Development has major projects closing soon. We're doing perfectly well. Martin's face tightened. Ethan noticed. So you're comfortable with $850,000 leaving your accounts right now? He asked. Dad's smile disappeared. It happened so quickly that even Brandon caught it. "What does that mean?" Brandon asked. "Nothing," Dad snapped. Ethan remained standing. "I asked a simple question. And my finances are none of your business." Martin looked down. Dad pointed toward Ethan. "You're at my daughter's wedding. Stop pretending you understand my company." "My wedding," I corrected him. Dad turned toward me. I stood. "You made money everyone's business when you brought an $850,000 check into my reception and handed me $50 so you could humiliate us." "Chloe." "No." That single word stopped him. For once, I didn't soften it. I didn't smile afterward. I didn't rescue him from the silence. Brandon looked between Dad and Martin. "Dad, what is Ethan talking about? Is there a problem with the money?" "There is no problem." Martin finally stepped closer. "Richard." Dad's jaw tightened. "Not now." But Martin continued anyway. His voice was low, yet the room was quiet enough that everyone nearest us heard him. "Ethan isn't just connected to your lender." Dad went completely still. Martin looked directly at him. "He's the man whose signature we've been waiting for." Dad's face changed instantly. "Martin, outside now." He grabbed Martin by the arm and headed toward a quieter side area near the reception hall doors. Ethan followed. So did I. And Brandon came right behind us, still clutching that ridiculous $850,000 ceremonial check. "What signature?" Brandon demanded. "What is he talking about?" Dad turned on Martin. "You don't discuss company business here." "You made it relevant," Martin said. Dad looked toward Ethan. "What exactly have you told them?" "Nothing," Ethan replied. Martin exhaled. "Richard, your company borrowed heavily during the expansion. Several developments underperformed. Your largest debt position was recently acquired." Brandon frowned. "Acquired by who?" Martin looked at Ethan before answering. "Cole Meridian Group." I froze. I knew that name. Ethan had mentioned Cole Meridian before. There had been business trips, late calls, and occasional conversations about his firm buying distressed commercial debt. But I had never connected any of it to my father. Dad had apparently never connected Ethan to it either. Martin continued. "Johnson Development has been requesting restructuring rather than asset liquidation." Brandon looked at Dad. "You told me the company was doing great." "It is." Martin glanced at the giant check in Brandon's hands. "Then giving away $850,000 tonight is an interesting way to demonstrate that." Dad bristled. "This gift proves we have liquidity." "No," Martin said. "While you're asking creditors for concessions, a transfer that large could raise serious questions about liquidity and management judgment." Brandon's fingers tightened around the check. "Wait." He looked at Dad. "Can I actually deposit this?" Dad didn't answer. "Dad." Mom appeared beside us. Her eyes immediately went to me. "This is your doing, isn't it?" I stared at her. Nobody forced Dad to announce $850,000 at my wedding. "Chloe." "Nobody forced you to hand me $50, and nobody forced either of you to mock Ethan." She had no response. Dad's attention shifted completely to my husband. The arrogance from minutes earlier was gone. "Ethan," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." "We already are." "I mean as family." Ethan shook his head. "I'm not negotiating company matters at our wedding." Dad swallowed. For the first time, he looked less like the man who controlled every room and more like someone, realizing he might have badly misjudged the person standing in front of him. Then his phone rang. Dad glanced at the screen. His face tightened. "Who is it?" Mom asked. He didn't answer her. I caught the name displayed on the screen. His chief financial officer. Dad answered. Yes. He listened for several seconds. Then he walked straight out of the reception hall without another word. Dad returned several minutes later without the confidence he had carried into my reception. Brandon was the first to confront him. Well, Dad ignored him. Richard, Mom said, what happened? He looked at the ceremonial check in Brandon's hands. The board wants the transfer stopped. Brandon stared at him. What? Until they review our liquidity position. But you already gave it to me. The money hasn't been transferred. Brandon lowered the check, as though it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. You stood in front of everyone and said it was mine. Dad snapped, this is bigger than your wedding. The irony was almost painful. Less than an hour earlier, my parents had used my wedding to announce Brandon's fortune. Now Dad wanted everyone to remember there were more important things than weddings. He turned toward Ethan. Tell me exactly who you are. Ethan glanced at me before answering. I'm co-founder and controlling shareholder of Cloe Meridian Group. Silence. Dad stared at him. Martin stepped forward. He's telling you the truth. Mom's lips parted. Brandon looked from Ethan to the giant check. Ethan continued calmly. Cloe Meridian purchased a portfolio of distressed commercial loans. Johnson Development's largest debt position was part of that portfolio. Dad's voice dropped. You knew. I knew my company had acquired the debt. I deliberately stayed away from your restructuring discussions because Chloe is your daughter. I didn't want family influencing a business decision. And you never thought to tell me. Ethan's expression barely changed. You never asked what I did. That landed. Dad had spent months calling Ethan a consultant. Mom had assumed our modest home meant we were struggling. Tonight, they had called him poor in front of an entire room. All because neither of them had considered him important enough to know. Dad looked toward Martin. So Ethan decides whether the restructuring goes through. Cloe Meridian controls the largest debt position, Martin said. Their approval matters considerably. Mom immediately stepped toward me. Chloe, sweetheart, this has gotten completely out of hand. I almost laughed at the sudden softness in her voice. It was a joke, she continued. The $50, what your father said, we were teasing. I looked down. The bill was still in my hand. I folded it once, slid it back into the little white envelope, and held it toward her. Mom hesitated before taking it. Then keep the joke. Her face went blank. Dad turned to Ethan. Surely you're not going to let personal feelings affect the company. I won't. Dad visibly relaxed. Then Ethan finished. And I won't let family earn you special treatment either. The relief vanished. Cloe Meridian's restructuring team will review Johnson Development under the same standards applied to every borrower. I won't interfere to punish you, and I won't interfere to rescue you. There was nothing Dad could argue with. The $850,000 check was canceled. Over the following months, Johnson Development survived, but not on Dad's terms. 2 luxury investment properties were sold to strengthen liquidity. As part of the restructuring, Dad surrendered day-to-day control of the company he had used for years as proof that he was untouchable. Brandon's destination wedding changed dramatically. Without the $850,000 gift, he reduced the budget and financed his own home. Some of the relatives who had laughed at our reception quietly distanced themselves after realizing Dad's public displays of wealth had hidden how much pressure his company was under. Months later, Dad called me. We could use your help reviewing some financial reports. There had been a time when those words would have sent me running back. I had spent years working late without extra pay because I thought being useful might finally make me valuable to him. This time I simply said, "No, Dad." There was a long silence. I have my own career. And that was the end of the conversation. Ethan never bought me some outrageous gift to prove he could beat Brandon's $850,000. He didn't need to. We stayed in the home we had chosen. I continued building my career. I kept contact with my parents limited, and respect became the price of having access to my life. Even Brandon eventually began paying his own way. And whenever I thought about our wedding, I didn't remember it as the cheap celebration my parents mocked. I remembered the moment I stopped competing for their approval. I had spent years believing the favored child was the rich one, but the day my parents handed me $50, I finally understood that the most valuable thing I could stop giving them was control over my worth.